Alright, so the best base workers in Tides of Terraria. I'm gonna start by just covering the best pals for each type of work suitability. We're not gonna be discussing things like if you want to buy food or buy Paldium fragments, or if you're gonna be running around transporting yourself or swapping pals on the fly, like if you're doing handiworking and then when you're not doing handiwork anymore, you're swapping your handiworkers for mining pals, or you're doing some food pals and then you're swapping in the kindling pals, nothing like that, just purely the best PAL for each type of work suitability, and then moving on to cover some of these hybrid PALs once you do get a lot of applied work technique books. Some of them are really good for the work technique books, some of them are pretty bad, and we're just going to be covering really what makes a PAL good and not for these applied work technique books. So the first thing worth mentioning is that as long as PALs have the same work level, there's no difference in work speed. There's no like hidden work speed factor. The things that affect how much a PAL will produce for you are things like the food consumption rate, which will affect how often the PAL goes and eats. This will affect the food uptime, like the buff. You get the 40% buff from minestrone, you get the 30% from salad, 50% work speed from mozzarella hamburger. So you generally want the high food consumption PALs. Then there's also some other minor differences between the slow walk speed, the run speeds between different workstations and stuff like that, which I'm going to be covering later on in the video. So let's just start with the best PALs for each work suitability without applied work technique books. Okay, so we're going to be starting with planting. So for planting we have Prunelia. Even without work technique books it will still be better than Lyeline just because of the low workload that plantations have. They spend the majority of the time celebrating. As long as you have a maxed out Prunelia, even without work technique books it will outscale the Lyeline or the Brahola. Then we have Gangler, new dark watering pal, level 4 watering pal. First one in that category, so that one is just a great watering pal in general. A little bit low on the food consumption, so if you are sleeping during nights, German Tide will still be better. Then we have Frostallion Noct, dark pal as well. So same thing there really. Dark, you could be using the Braholda instead, but overall, like if you're missing nights or depending what your settings are, you have Frostallion Noct will be like the better pal there. For kindling, I'm gonna recommend German Tide just because Rio is such a chore to breed for. So German Tide still ends up being a little bit smoother there. Kindling doesn't have 100% uptime, so Rio is really nice because the pal would do kindling and then go and mine. And mining is almost always the bottleneck. Like one maxed handiworker needs 30 mining pals to keep up if you're doing legendary spheres or something like that. But overall, Ignis is fine. Then for handiwork itself, you have the Anubis versus Splatterina is pretty common, even Silene there. And it just kind of depends on what you want from the pal. I prefer Anubis just because it can go on mine when it's not doing handiwork, so handiwork is one of these work suitabilities that doesn't have 100% uptime. So this thing that it works nights is kind of redundant unless you're queuing up like 9,999 missiles or something like that in those rare cases. But then you can also just swap in pals as you need. Like I usually, if I'm crafting a bunch of legendary weapons, just swap in 4 extra Anubis and do it that way. For transport, generally the new Eye is better than Noklem, but it's not a huge difference. Like even for these transport pals, you can just skip passes altogether. Like most of the time the pal's just standing still transporting to the chest, but we will cover that later on in the video as well. Worth mentioning Vanworm here as well. Just an easy pal to get, catch a bunch of them, it will do the ranch base fine. The skill fruit base, but usually skill fruit bases will not be bottlenecked by transport, but that depends if you're mixing it with ranching. But these three are all good options. The Eye ends up being the best one out of them without the applied work technique books. For cooling, I recommend Bastigor, just because it's easier to breed for, so another plus for Anubis. You breed your Anubis, then you can also chain that with Frostallion straight into Bastigor. No need to worry about catching stuck with the Akuma or anything like that. Mining, still just Astigon, it's been that way for over a year now. Naturally, Nocturnal Mining Pal mining has 100% uptime, so there's no need to really consider secondary work suitabilities. For electricity, Orsirk is still king there just because electricity has a pretty low uptime, so we'll just do the electricity, and then you can either have it do some handiwork or some transporting. Then another couple of pals or humans worth mentioning is the Gourmet Hunter, the Blacksmith in Training, and the Desert Town Ambassador. Catching these is always nice because they give free items, so whatever you really want from them, like you can just spam talk to them over and over and over and you get some pretty good items from them. The Wandering Merchant sells a lot of the good stuff. You can even catch like all the different merchants in the game, so that's just something to keep in mind. Caravan Leader for selling ammo. Just nice overall. Then we have the farming pals. It's really only the bee that you need. You can buy all the other stuff in huge quantities, but the bee, you can't buy the honey. Work speed passives work on them, so all the ranch pals you want, you kind of just go pure work speed on them and a lot of souls, I guess. Then Shroomer Noct. This is my go-to lumbering pal, as also here without the applied technique books. Since late game, you generally don't use a lot of wood. You can just keep a couple of these in the bases. Depends really on if you're doing this like default settings with 4 bases and 15 base pals. It might be a little bit like, it's always nice if you're doing like brutal work mode and stuff like that. So I just prefer to keep this pal for all this sort of lumbering needs and then have the partner skill on top of that. Braloa, so you could like, I still rate these pals higher than Braloa, but Braloa you're gonna want one in your breeding base if it's something you care about. So you might as well just kind of breed for either a combat Braloa or a work speed Braloa, because why not if you're gonna have a 4-star one anyway. Then we have these sort of just breeding, suffering, breeding, making children for you to butcher for curry. Could have been stuff like Anubis or for Stallion for the souls. You got the Walaska for Coralum. You also have stuff like Musarina for the Musarina hamburger. So just anything you want to breed and butcher, you just use in these kind of bases. Then we're going to be moving on to the hybrid pals and what makes a hybrid pal good or not. So first things to cover here is the priority system. We got ranching, electricity, kindling, gathering, transporting food from plantations and stuff like that, the kitchen, then planting, watering the plantations, just normal watering like the crusher in the mill, handiwork, mining, lumbering, transport, and cooling. So this priority system will have a big impact on what pals you actually need the books for. Then you also have to consider the uptime. So something like lumbering and mining, they're just going to be doing that 24/7. You don't really need to consider that sort of thing for the books. But something like the part-time jobs like electricity, kindling, watering, handiwork, and cooling, that's where you're going to want probably to do this applied work technique book thing. So what makes a pal good here? Let's take a look at suits here. First it's going to do kindling, then it's going to go craft, and then it's going to go mine. So in general this is a pretty good sort of hybrid pal. Well, if we take a look at something like Bastigor, you kind of want it to go to the cold crusher and then go mining, but it doesn't really work out because mining and lumbering have a higher priority. So it'll just stand at a mining pit forever and never really go to the cold crusher unless you manually assign it. So it's just a little bit of a downside for pals like that. So this priority system is something that you need to consider for these pals. And then we're also going to be moving on to cover this food and sanity combination here. So set up a quick test just to highlight the difference between the food consumption and the sanity and how that affects the food buff uptime and just how much pals will produce over the course of like a 30-minute or 1-hour playthrough. So all these pals, identical mining level, identical passives, identical food buff to start. And we're just going to start them off working at the stone pit, which has a decent amount of sanity drain. And we're just going to kind of see how the food buff plays out. So what's going to end up happening, they're all going to start producing at the exact same rate here. Then eventually some of them are going to go take breaks. Some of them are not going to take breaks. Going to cover that soon in the video as well. We got the minestrone, which means that pals will get sanity when they do go and eat. So high food consumption pals, they will have a higher amount of food buff uptime. We're going to show that. So now we're just going to wait for 10 minutes. We're going to see when this food buff expires, which pals have gone and eaten and which have not gone and eaten yet. We got like Rio, Sootsir, Anubis, Lavander, and Depresso in this example, all having different food consumption rates in order there. So the food buff scales multiplicatively. You get 30% from salad and pizza, 40% from minestrone, 50% from Musarina hamburger. So it's just a really great buff. So you want to maintain that 100% uptime if it's a 100% working pal. So you got something like Depresso, the food buff is just not going to be up there all that time. So even if these pals all have the exact same work speed stats, it's going to be a difference in how often they go to the hot springs and how often they just go and eat and get that food buff. So we're just going to wait until this buff expires here. Alright, so the food buff on Depresso is just about to expire, just above the health bar there, the hammer, it expired there. We checked the Lavander, no food buff. Anubis has a food buff, so it just went and ate. Sootsir, no food buff. So Sootsir, higher food consumption, but it does not have the food buff yet. And that is explained by this pure randomness due to Sanity. And even Rio with its high food consumption has not gone and eaten yet. So how does that happen? Well, when you have this sort of Sanity way that Palworld works, it does a check every 80 seconds. Depending on the pal's Sanity threshold, there's a couple things that can happen. So when the pal is below 85 to 65, it can take a break or it can keep working. Then below 65, it can get upset and go to bed, or upset and not willing to work. So it's just these different kind of intervals. So if a pal is below 40%, it could get sick, it could get overeat, it could get upset and go to bed, it could do like slacking, or it could take a break. So a pal could work the entirety of the day. So just doing a test like comparing these 5 pals for 30 minutes and checking which one has produced more just won't work, just due to this random factor when they go to the hot springs. Pals in the hot springs will not consume hunger, which means that they will not maintain that food buff uptime. You can also see Depresso there just moving really slowly. That's what I mean with this slow walk speed. So pals moving to the hot spring, they use their slow walk speed stat, which means that pals that run quickly to the hot spring, they will reach the hot spring, start gaining sanity, while something like Depresso, depending on how the layout of your base is, it will actually never reach the hot spring in this like 80-second interval that the game does this check. So it's just going to start walking to the hot spring, then it's going to be 80 seconds past, it's going to go back to the stone pit, start mining, then it's going to do an 80-second check, it might go take a break, it might start slacking. So you can see here, it's just never making it to the hot spring. So what ended up happening here in this example is that Anubis did not go to the hot spring, it did not take a break. It just kept on working, so it used a lot more hunger and went and ate and got the food buff. Soothsayer, Rio, all those pals, they at some point went to the hot springs and took a break, so they did not get the food buff. So now we're just going to wait for another 30 minutes to let things settle down and check them again. 30 minutes later, Soothsayer's food buff wears out there and it has still not gone to eat. So even with this very high food consumption that it has, it still doesn't maintain that 100% food buff uptime. So this is what I was talking about before, with just having these like very high food consumption pals, stuff like Astegon, Noklem, or whatever mining pal you're using. You do want it to be near that maximum amount of food consumption, because that Soothsayer had 1.5 minutes where it did not go and eat. So if you're not feeding the pals manually, something like Rio here will maintain that 100% food buff uptime. So despite having the same work level, the Rio will end up mining just a little bit more. That 1.5 minutes becomes pretty substantial, but at the same time, you're probably just overproducing everything anyway. But that means that the pals that you're really looking for with these applied work technique books are probably dark pals with a very high food consumption rate. Alright, so with that, the pals that I sort of recommend that you do this applied technique book things for is for electricity. You can have like either the Helsifer Lux or the Pen King. They will do the electricity, and then they will do either the transporting, or you can have it do transporting, mining, and handiwork, or even watering. This pal here is something that, like, if you're gonna give something to a cooling pal, it's not really gonna be a hybrid pal, but it is nocturnal, so just a little bit better than the Bastigor. And then you could also do the manual assigning to different crushers, and then having it do transporting with unassigning it again. Gelroy and Jelliet, I don't recommend these just because the partner skill doesn't seem to work on mills and crushers, and as mentioned before, like you don't need more work speed on plantations than you already have, so you're probably better off just keeping one gangler. Could do something for like Phalaris Aqua instead, it will do the watering and transporting, or same thing with gangler, watering and transporting and being naturally nocturnal. Phalaris, more food consumption. For kindling, I like Soothsayer. You also do have the option of just running this Rio, doing kindling and then down to mining. Something like Incineram, the food consumption is just a little bit too low. We also have the Phalaris, it can do kindling and then transport. This one here is more like both in the electricity and the handiwork factor. So if you do want a handiwork pal, you can have like the Orsorks maxed out for handiwork, and then they will go do the electricity generating, and then they will do the transporting. We got Shroomer as well, just a great pal for these applied work technique books. It can do the planting, the gathering as a dark pal, handiworking, and logging. And then it just has the partner skill on top of that. And then Anubis as well, just having that handiwork, and then maxed out mining or transporting. And for transport pals, pretty much Mimog. You could go for something like Phalaris as well, it's a good one. But Mimog has the fastest run speed, so as mentioned before, with the correct chest placements, Mimo just ends up being very good for transporting. So that's it for this base pals video. Thanks for watching.